The bitter wind howled through the streets of Fort Garland, Colorado, on that fateful December night in 1878, whipping snowflakes into frenzied spirals and rattling the loose shutters of Thornton's Mercantile. Tessa Drake pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she rushed to complete the inventory before the threatening blizzard descended in full force. Little did she know that the kerosene lamp balanced precariously near the curtains would change the course of her life forever. Thomas Vaughn had just finished stabling his horse at the livery when he noticed the first tendrils of smoke rising against the night sky. The 30-year-old cowboy had only planned to stay in Fort Garland for a night before continuing on to his sister's homestead near Trinidad. But something about that smoke made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He tugged his hat down against the biting wind and trudged through ankle-deep snow toward the glow that was growing brighter by the second. Tessa coughed violently as smoke filled the back room of the Mercantile. She'd been checking the last shipment of winter supplies when she heard the crash of the lamp and the whoosh of flame catching on the dry cotton fabrics. Now the fire was spreading with terrifying speed, consuming the wooden shelves and climbing up the walls. The main door was already blocked by fallen beams, and the back exit had jammed in the frame swollen from the winter moisture. "Help!" she called out, her voice raspy from the smoke. "Is anyone there?" The crackling of the flames seemed to mock her cries as she frantically searched for another way out. Outside, Thomas broke into a run when he realized the Mercantile was ablaze. As he approached, he could hear faint cries from within. Without hesitation, he wrapped his bandana around his face and kicked at the back door with his boot. The wood splintered on the third kick, giving way enough for him to force his shoulder against it. "Hello," he called, ducking low to avoid the worst of the smoke that billowed out. "Anyone in here?" Tessa stumbled toward the sound of his voice, disoriented from the smoke and the heat. "Here," she managed before another fit of coughing overtook her. Thomas followed her voice, pushing through the thickening smoke until he found her leaning against a shelf, her face blackened, her eyes watering. "I've got you, madam," he said, lifting her into his arms without ceremony. "Hold on tight." She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck as he turned back toward the door. The flames were spreading faster now, licking at the ceiling and sending burning debris crashing down around them. Thomas ducked and weaved, shielding Tessa with his body as he made for the exit. A flaming beam crashed down just behind them, sending a shower of sparks over Thomas's back. He gritted his teeth against the pain and pushed forward. The cold air hit them like a blessing as Thomas carried Tessa out into the snowy night. He didn't stop until they were well away from the burning building, setting her down gently on a bench outside the town's small sheriff's office. By now, others had spotted the fire, and shouts filled the air as the townspeople organized a bucket brigade. "Are you all right, madam?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle despite its roughness. Tessa looked up at her rescuer, seeing him clearly for the first time. His face was smudged with soot, blue eyes striking against the darkness of his smoke-stained skin. His dark hair curled slightly where it escaped his hat, and his strong jaw was set with concern. "I think so," she replied, her voice hoarse. "Thanks to you, Mr. Vaughn, Thomas Vaughn." He removed his hat, a gesture of respect despite the chaos around them. "And you are Tessa Drake. I worked at the Mercantile." She glanced back at the building, now fully engulfed in flames. "Everything's gone," she whispered, the reality of her situation beginning to sink in. Thomas followed her gaze. "Was that your home as well?" She nodded, tears cutting clean tracks down her sooty cheeks. "I had a room above the store, all my possessions, my savings." A violent coughing fit interrupted her words. Thomas immediately shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You need a doctor, Miss Drake." Before she could protest, he'd lifted her into his arms once more. The town doctor's house was just down the street, and Thomas carried her there with sure strides, his boots crunching in the freshly fallen snow. Dr. Samuel Wilson was already grabbing his bag when Thomas kicked at his door. "Saw the fire," the elderly doctor said by way of greeting, ushering them inside. "Put her on the examination table." Thomas gently set Tessa down, but she found herself reluctant to let go of his steadying presence. "Please stay," she whispered, surprising herself with the request. Something in her eyes must have spoken to him, because he nodded, stepping back just enough to give the doctor room to work, but remaining close enough that Tessa could see him. "You've breathed in quite a bit of smoke, young lady," Dr. Wilson said after examining her. "Your lungs need time to clear. I'd recommend rest, plenty of water, and staying indoors for the next few days." He turned to Thomas. "And you, young man, let me see your back." Thomas started to protest, but the doctor was already pulling up his shirt, revealing angry red burns where sparks had fallen on him during the rescue. "It's nothing," Thomas insisted. "Burns are never nothing," Dr. Wilson replied firmly, already preparing a salve. "These need treatment to prevent infection." While the doctor tended to Thomas's burns, Tessa realized the full extent of her situation. "I have nowhere to go," she said softly. "No clothes but what I'm wearing, no money." "The church takes in those in need, doctor," Wilson offered as he wrapped bandages around Thomas's torso. "Reverend Palmer and his wife have a spare room they use for just such emergencies." "I'll take her there," Thomas said, wincing slightly as he pulled his shirt back down. Dr. Wilson nodded. "First, both of you need to drink this." He handed them each a cup of water with something mixed in. "It'll help with the smoke in your lungs." After they'd drunk the doctor's remedy, Thomas helped Tessa to her feet. She was still unsteady, and he kept a supportive arm around her waist as they made their way through the snowy streets to the small white church at the edge of town. Reverend Palmer and his wife, Martha, welcomed them with open arms despite the late hour. "Of course you can stay, dear," Martha said, already bustling about to prepare the spare room. "We heard the commotion and were just about to head out to see if we could help." "You're the new girl at Thornton's, aren't you?" Reverend Palmer asked, recognition dawning on his kind face. "Only been in town a month or so," Tessa nodded. "Mr. Thornton gave me the job when I arrived from Denver. I was saving to buy my own place someday." Her voice caught. "Now I have to start over again." "The Lord provides, child," Reverend Palmer said gently. "And it seems he's already provided you with a guardian angel." He nodded toward Thomas. Thomas shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, Reverend." Martha returned with a nightgown and robe. "These should fit you well enough, dear. The spare room is ready whenever you'd like to retire. You must be exhausted." Indeed, Tessa could barely keep her eyes open, the events of the evening catching up with her all at once. "Thank you for your kindness," she said, accepting the clothes. Thomas cleared his throat. "I should be going," he said, reaching for his hat. "The livery has a room I can use for the night." "Nonsense," Martha declared. "We have a cot in the study. The livery is all the way across town and you're injured. You'll stay here tonight." Thomas looked like he might argue, but something in Martha's determined expression made him reconsider. "That's mighty kind of you, madam." As they said their good nights, Tessa caught Thomas's sleeve. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Vaughn," she said softly. "You saved my life tonight." He tipped his hat, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Anyone would have done the same, Miss Drake. Not anyone would have run into a burning building in the middle of a snowstorm," she countered. For a moment, their eyes held, and Tessa felt something stir within her chest that had nothing to do with the smoke she'd inhaled. Then Martha was at her elbow, guiding her toward the spare room, and the moment passed. That night, as Tessa lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the howling wind outside, she found herself thinking of Thomas Vaughn's strong arms carrying her to safety, of the determined set of his jaw as he'd fought through the flames. Sleep came eventually, but her dreams were filled with fire and snow, and a pair of intense blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. Morning brought a heavy blanket of snow and the acrid smell of wet, burned timber. Tessa woke to find clothes laid out for her donations from church members who'd heard about the fire overnight. She dressed gratefully and made her way to the kitchen, where Martha was cooking breakfast. "Good morning, dear," Martha greeted her. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," Tessa replied, though her throat still felt raw. "Is Mr. Vaughn still here?" "He's outside, clearing the walkway," Martha said with a smile. "That young man was up at dawn, insisting on making himself useful. Wouldn't even wait for his burns to be checked before grabbing the shovel." Tessa went to the window and saw Thomas methodically clearing snow from the path to the church door. His movements were confident and strong, though she noticed he favored his right side slightly, likely due to the burns on his back. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and caught her eye through the window. He tipped his hat with a small smile that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "He's a good man," Martha observed, watching Tessa's reaction with knowing eyes. "Don't see many like him these days." Tessa turned from the window, feeling a blush creep into her cheeks. "I owe him my life." "From what I hear, you're not the first he's helped," Martha said, turning back to her cooking. "Reverend spoke with Sheriff Davis this morning. Turns out Mr. Vaughn has quite a reputation as a man who stands up for those who need it most." Before Tessa could ask more, the door opened and Thomas stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the clean scent of snow. "Path's clear, Mrs. Palmer," he announced, stomping snow from his boots. "Bless you, Mr. Vaughn," Martha replied. "Now come sit and have some breakfast." "You too, Miss Drake." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, with Reverend Palmer joining them shortly after. It was he who broached the subject that Tessa had been avoiding. "Miss Drake, we've been discussing your situation," he began. "The church has a small emergency fund for cases like yours. It's not much, but it should help you get back on your feet." "That's very generous," Tessa said, touched by the offer. "But I couldn't. It's what it's there for," Martha insisted. "Besides, we've already had several townspeople drop by with offers of help. Mrs. Henderson at the hotel says she needs a front desk clerk, and she has a room available for staff. And Thornton made it through the fire," Thomas added. "I saw him this morning. He's shaken up, but he's already talking about rebuilding. Says he'll have a job for you when he does." Tessa looked around the table, overwhelmed by the kindness of these people, most of whom she barely knew. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept the help," Reverend Palmer suggested gently. "And someday, when you're able, you can help someone else in need." She nodded, tears threatening again. "Thank you, all of you." After breakfast, Thomas announced his intention to continue his journey. "My sister's expecting me," he explained, though he seemed reluctant to leave. "She's alone on that homestead with her 2 kids and with this snow." "Of course you must go," Reverend Palmer agreed. "Family comes first." Tessa walked with Thomas to the livery to fetch his horse. The town was oddly quiet under its blanket of snow, with only the blackened skeleton of the Mercantile breaking the pristine whiteness. "Will you be all right?" Thomas asked as they walked, their breaths forming clouds in the cold air. "I think so," Tessa replied. "Everyone's been so kind." "I'll find my way." They reached the livery and Thomas began saddling his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that nudged his shoulder affectionately. "Where is your sister's homestead?" Tessa asked, not ready for him to leave just yet. "Near Trinidad," Thomas replied, checking the cinch on his saddle. "About a 2-day ride in good weather. Might take longer in this snow." Tessa nodded, searching for something to say that wouldn't sound desperate or overly sentimental. "Well, I hope you have a safe journey, Mr. Vaughn, and thank you again for everything." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I'm glad I was there, Miss Drake, truly." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be coming back through Fort Garland in a few weeks. Perhaps I could call on you then, make sure you're settling in all right." Her heart skipped a beat. "I'd like that," she said, trying to keep her voice even. He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his rugged face. "Then I'll see you in a few weeks." He mounted his horse with the ease of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, tipped his hat one last time, and rode off into the snowy landscape. Tessa watched until he was just a dark speck against the whiteness, then turned back toward the church, already counting the days until his return. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity for Tessa. She took the job at Henderson's hotel, working at the front desk during the day and helping with cleaning in the mornings. The work was easier than the Mercantile had been, and Mrs. Henderson was a fair employer who didn't mind that Tessa sometimes coughed when the air was particularly dry. The townspeople had been generous with donations of clothing and necessities, and Tessa had managed to save a little from her wages. She'd even made friends with Olivia Jensen, the schoolteacher who often stayed at the hotel when the weather was too harsh for her to return to her cabin outside of town. But despite keeping busy, Tessa found her thoughts often straying to Thomas Vaughn. She wondered how his visit with his sister was going, if he was safe, if he would truly return to Fort Garland as promised. She told herself it was natural to think of the man who had saved her life, but deep down, she knew there was more to it than mere gratitude. It was nearly 3 weeks after the fire when a familiar figure walked through the doors of Henderson's hotel. Tessa was at the front desk, recording the day's transactions in the ledger, when she heard the distinctive jingle of spurs against the wooden floor. She looked up, and there he was, looking more handsome than she remembered in a clean shirt and with his dark hair freshly trimmed. Her heart did that strange little skip again. "Mr. Vaughn," she greeted him, trying to keep her voice professional despite the flush she could feel spreading across her cheeks. "Welcome back to Fort Garland." His smile was warm as he approached the desk. "Miss Drake, it's good to see you looking so well." "And you," she replied, noting that he moved more freely now, the burns on his back apparently healed. "How was your visit with your sister?" "Eventful," he said with a chuckle. "My nephew is at that age where everything is an adventure, and my niece's talking now won't stop, in fact." The fondness in his voice when he spoke of his family made something twist pleasantly in Tessa's chest. "They sound wonderful." "They are," he agreed, "though I'm glad to be back." His eyes held hers for a moment before he added, "I was hoping I might take you to dinner tonight if you're free." Tessa's breath caught. "I'd like that very much," she said before she could overthink it. 7 o'clock, she nodded. "I'll be ready." He tipped his hat and turned to go, then paused. "Oh, I nearly forgot. I need a room for a few nights." Tessa managed to maintain her composure as she assigned him a room and handed over the key, but the moment he disappeared up the stairs, she pressed her hands to her cheeks, feeling the heat of her blush. "Well now," came Mrs. Henderson's amused voice from the doorway behind her. "I haven't seen you look that flustered since you started working here." Tessa turned, embarrassed at being caught in such a state. "He's the one who saved me from the fire," she explained. "Is that all he is?" Mrs. Henderson asked with a knowing smile. "Because that look on your face suggests otherwise." Tessa couldn't help but laugh. I hardly know him. Sometimes that's how the best stories begin, Mrs. Henderson said with a wink. Now I assume you'll want the evening off, Tessa hesitated. I don't want to leave you short-handed. Nonsense. I managed this place for 20 years before you came along. I think I can handle one evening. She shooed Tessa toward the stairs. Go on now. Find something pretty to wear. That blue dress Mrs. Palmer brought by would be perfect. At precisely 7 o'clock, Tessa descended the hotel stairs to find Thomas waiting in the lobby. He wore a clean black coat over his shirt, and his boots had been polished to a shine. He looked up as she approached, and the appreciation in his eyes made her glad she'd taken extra care with her appearance. You look beautiful, Miss Drake, he said, offering his arm. Thank you, Mr. Vaughn, she replied, placing her hand on his sleeve. And please call me Tessa. Only if you'll call me Thomas, he returned with a smile that made her heart flutter. He escorted her to the town's only restaurant, a small establishment attached to the saloon but separated enough to be considered respectable for a lady to dine there. The proprietor, Mr. Holloway, greeted them warmly and led them to a table near the window. I took the liberty of ordering something special, Mr. Holloway informed them. On the house, of course. It's not every day we get to serve a hero and the lady he rescued. Tessa felt herself blush again. Word travels fast in Fort Garland, she murmured to Thomas after Mr. Holloway had left. Small towns, Thomas said with a shrug. My sister lives near one even smaller than this. By the time I arrived, they'd somehow heard about the fire and had me pegged as some kind of knight in shining armor. Aren't you? Tessa asked, only half teasing. He looked down, seemingly uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what needed doing, that's all. Their dinner arrived venison stew with fresh baked bread, and they fell into easy conversation. Thomas told her about growing up on a ranch in Wyoming, about losing his parents to fever 5 years ago, and about his sister being his only remaining family. What about you? He asked. Any family waiting for you back in Denver? Tessa shook her head. My father died in the war and my mother passed 2 years ago. I came to Colorado hoping for a fresh start. She gave a rueful smile, though I didn't expect to be starting over quite so soon. What brought you to Fort Garland specifically? I had a friend who'd settled here, Charlotte Miller. She wrote me about job opportunities, so I came. Her expression dimmed, but she'd moved on by the time I arrived, gone to California with her new husband. So you stayed anyway. Tessa nodded. Mr. Thornton offered me the position at the Mercantile, and I'd spent nearly all my savings getting here. Didn't have much choice but to take what was offered. And now, Thomas asked, his eyes serious, will you stay in Fort Garland? It was a weighted question, and Tessa knew it. I think so, she said softly. I'm beginning to feel like I belong here. The look in his eyes made her breath catch. I'm glad to hear that, he said. After dinner, they walked through the quiet town, the crisp winter air nipping at their cheeks. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and overhead, the stars shone with crystal clarity in the high mountain sky. It's beautiful here, Tessa remarked, looking up at the vast expanse of stars. Even with the cold. Especially with the cold, Thomas corrected with a smile. Keeps the air clear. They paused at the site of the Mercantile. Construction had already begun on the new building, the skeleton of its frame rising from the ashes of the old. Mr. Thornton works fast, Thomas observed. He's determined to be open by spring, Tessa replied. Says Fort Garland can't go a whole season without a proper store. Thomas turned to her, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. Will you go back to working there when it's rebuilt? Tessa considered the question. I don't know, Mrs. Henderson has been good to me and the hotel work is steady year-round. She looked up at him. What about you? Will you be passing through Fort Garland again? He held her gaze, and something in his eyes made her heart race. I'm thinking I might do more than pass through, he said quietly. If I had a reason to stay. The implication hung between them, as tangible as the clouds of their breath in the cold air. Tessa found herself taking a step closer to him, drawn by something she couldn't name. Thomas, she began, but was interrupted by the town clock striking 9. He smiled, breaking the tension of the moment. I should get you back to the hotel. Mrs. Henderson will think I've run off with you. The walk back was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. At the hotel entrance, Thomas turned to her. Thank you for dining with me tonight, Tessa, he said formally, though his eyes were warm. Thank you for asking me, she replied. Will I see you tomorrow? He nodded. I'll be in town for a few days at least. I've taken on some work with the sheriff helping track down a gang that's been robbing stage coaches between here and Trinidad. Concern flashed through her. That sounds dangerous. It's just tracking for now, he assured her. Following trails, gathering information. Sheriff Davis doesn't expect any confrontations. Still, the thought of him facing danger twisted something in Tessa's chest. Be careful, Thomas. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers warm against her cold skin. I will, especially now that I have something to be careful for. Before she could respond, he bent down and pressed a soft, brief kiss to her lips. It was over almost before it began, but it left Tessa breathless. Good night, Tessa, he whispered, stepping back. Good night, Thomas, she managed, her heart racing. She watched him walk up the stairs to his room, then touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. For the first time since the fire, Tessa felt truly hopeful about her future in Fort Garland. The next morning, Thomas was gone before Tessa started her shift at the front desk. Mrs. Henderson informed her that he'd left at dawn with Sheriff Davis and 2 other men. Said to tell you not to worry, Mrs. Henderson added with a knowing smile, and that he'd be back by nightfall. Tessa tried to focus on her work throughout the day, but her mind kept returning to Thomas, to their dinner, their walk, that brief but meaningful kiss. She found herself watching the clock, counting the hours until evening, but nightfall came and went with no sign of Thomas or the sheriff. Tessa stayed at the front desk long after her shift ended, pretending to organize papers while really listening for the sound of horses approaching. You should get some rest, dear, Mrs. Henderson said gently around 10 o'clock. I'm sure they just got delayed. The trails can be tricky this time of year. Reluctantly, Tessa retired to her room, though she doubted she would sleep. She sat by the window, watching the empty street below, telling herself there were 100 innocent reasons why they might be late returning. It was nearly midnight when she heard the commotion, horses arriving, men's voices, a flurry of activity. She threw a shawl over her nightgown and hurried downstairs, propriety forgotten in her relief. The sight that greeted her in the lobby stopped her cold. Sheriff Davis was there, along with Dr. Wilson and one of the other men who'd left that morning. And between them, supported on either side, was Thomas, his face bloody, his left arm hanging at an awkward angle. Thomas, she cried, rushing forward. He looked up at her voice, managing a weak smile despite his obvious pain. Tessa. I'm all right. Just got thrown from my horse. He's being modest, Sheriff Davis said grimly. We ran into those stagecoach robbers. Vaughn here took a bullet in the shoulder and fell down a ravine. Lucky it wasn't worse. Dr. Wilson was already directing them toward one of the downstairs rooms. I need to get that bullet out and set his arm. Miss Drake, would you fetch my bag from outside? And we'll need hot water and clean linens. The next hour was a blur as Tessa assisted the doctor in treating Thomas's wounds. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, which Dr. Wilson declared a blessing, but his arm was broken and would need weeks to heal properly. Thomas bore the pain stoically, only once letting out a groan when the doctor set the bone. Finally, with Thomas's wounds cleaned, stitched, and bandaged, and his arm set in a splint, Dr. Wilson prepared to leave. He'll need rest, the doctor instructed Tessa, who had refused to leave Thomas's side. And someone should check on him through the night. Fever is the real danger now. I'll stay with him, Tessa said immediately. Dr. Wilson gave her a knowing look but didn't argue. Very well. If his temperature rises or the wound starts to seep, send for me immediately. After the doctor left, Tessa pulled a chair beside Thomas's bed and gently bathed his forehead with a cool cloth. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, the laudanum doctor. Wilson had given him for the pain, making him drowsy. Didn't mean to worry you, he murmured, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. SHH, she soothed. Just rest now. Need to tell you something, he insisted, fighting against the pull of the medicine. Been thinking about it all day. She leaned closer. What is it, Thomas? I'm falling in love with you, Tessa Drake, he said, his words slurring slightly but his gaze suddenly clear and intense. Been falling since I carried you out of that fire. Her heart soared at his words, even as she wondered if it was just the laudanum talking. Thomas, need you to know, he continued, his good hand catching hers. In case something happens. Nothing's going to happen, she assured him, squeezing his hand. You're going to heal, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about this. He seemed satisfied with that, his eyes drifting closed as the medicine finally overcame his determination to stay awake. Promise you'll be here when I wake up, he mumbled. I promise, she whispered, bringing his hand to her lips. I'm not going anywhere. True to her word, Tessa stayed by Thomas's side through the night. She dozed occasionally in the chair but woke at his slightest movement, checking his forehead for fever and adjusting his blankets when he shivered. By morning, she was exhausted but relieved his temperature had remained normal, and the wound showed no signs of infection. Mrs. Henderson found her there at dawn, still holding Thomas's hand. The older woman took one look at the situation and nodded decisively. I'll have Jenny cover the front desk today, she said. You stay and take care of our hero. Tessa started to protest, but Mrs. Henderson waved her off. Girl, I've seen the way you look at him, and the way he looks at you. Some things are more important than work schedules. Over the next 2 weeks, Tessa divided her time between her duties at the hotel and caring for Thomas. His recovery was steady but slow, the broken arm causing more trouble than the bullet wound. He chafed at the forced inactivity, used as he was to a life of constant movement and physical work. I'm not made for sitting still, he complained one afternoon as Tessa changed his bandages. A man needs purpose. Your purpose right now is to heal, she told him firmly, though her hands were gentle as she wrapped fresh linen around his shoulder. Sheriff Davis says they caught the rest of that gang, so you don't need to worry about that anymore. Thomas caught her wrist as she finished, his fingers warm against her pulse. I've been thinking about what I said that first night, he said, his eyes serious, about falling in love with you. Tessa's heart stuttered. She'd wondered if he even remembered saying it and had been too afraid to bring it up. You were in pain and the laudanum didn't invent my feelings, he interrupted. Maybe it made me brave enough to say them, but they were true then and they're true now. He took a deep breath. I know it's fast, we barely know each other, but sometimes a man just knows. Tessa sat on the edge of his bed, her hands trembling slightly. I've been afraid to trust it, she admitted. After losing my parents, losing Charlotte's friendship, I started to think that nothing good ever lasts. I can't promise forever, Thomas said honestly. No one can, but I can promise to try every day to be worthy of you, to protect you, to cherish you, to build a life with you if you'll have me. Tears welled in Tessa's eyes. "I think I started falling in love with you when you carried me through that smoke," she confessed. "And every day since has only made me more certain." The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. With his good arm, he pulled her closer and kissed her properly this time, a kiss full of promise and longing and joy. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "When I'm healed," he whispered, "I'm going to court you properly. Take you on picnics when the weather turns. Dance with you at the spring festival. Show you I'm more than just a man who runs into burning buildings." Tessa laughed softly. "I already know you're more than that, but I won't say no to being courted." As spring melted the snows and brought new life to Fort Garland, Thomas made good on his promise. His arm healed enough for him to return to limited work, helping Sheriff Davis with peacekeeping duties around town. The position kept him in Fort Garland and close to Tessa. They took walks along the river when the ice thawed, rode out to the nearby meadows to see the first wildflowers push through the soil, and spent evenings on the hotel's porch, talking about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Thomas spoke of wanting his own ranch someday, and Tessa shared her dream of opening a small bookshop, something Fort Garland lacked. By the time summer arrived, bringing with it long, golden evenings and the scent of sage on the warm breeze, they were inseparable. The townspeople had grown used to seeing them together, and no one was surprised when Thomas began building a small house on a plot of land just outside town. "It's not much," he told Tessa as he showed her the nearly completed structure one July evening. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room. "But there's room to expand, and the land is good enough for a garden, maybe some chickens, eventually a few horses." Tessa walked through the rooms, running her hand along the walls he'd built with his own hands. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. The house was simple but solid, built with care and attention to detail. Just like Thomas's love for her, he watched her nervous exploration with anxious eyes. "There's something I need to ask you," he said when she returned to his side. Tessa's heart quickened as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment," he admitted, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small pearl. "It was my mother's. She'd want you to have it." He took a deep breath. "Tessa Drake, will you marry me? Will you make this house a home with me?" Tears of happiness spilled down Tessa's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Thomas Vaughn." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then lifted her off her feet, spinning her around despite the twinge in his still healing arm. Her laughter filled the empty rooms of their future home, chasing away the ghosts of their lonely pasts. They were married in September, with the aspen trees turning gold on the mountainsides. Reverend Palmer performed the ceremony in the church where Tessa had stayed that first night after the fire. Mrs. Henderson cried openly during the vows, and Sheriff Davis stood as Thomas's best man. Even Mr. Thornton closed the newly rebuilt Mercantile for the day to attend. Thomas's sister, Catherine, came from Trinidad with her children, who immediately adopted Tessa as their new favorite aunt. "He's different with you," Catherine told Tessa at the small reception afterward. "Happier than I've seen him since our parents died. Thank you for that." "He's made me just as happy," Tessa replied, watching as Thomas swung his young niece around in an improvised dance, his face alight with joy. "I never expected to find this kind of love, especially not in a burning building." Catherine laughed. "That's Thomas for you. Never does anything the conventional way." That night, Thomas carried Tessa over the threshold of their new home, this time not as a rescue, but as a beginning. The house was simply furnished but warm and inviting, with curtains Tessa had sewn herself, and a quilt made by the church ladies as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," Thomas said as he set her down in the middle of their sitting room. The name still felt new and wonderful to her ears. "It sounds perfect when you say it," she told him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "It is perfect," he murmured against her lips. "You're perfect." Later, as they lay together in their new bed, Thomas traced lazy patterns on Tessa's bare shoulder. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked softly. "The fire," she nodded against his chest. "Sometimes. Mostly I remember how safe I felt when you carried me out. Even with the flames all around us, I knew I'd be all right because you were there." He pulled her closer. "I was so scared," he admitted. "Not of the fire, but of not reaching you in time, when I heard your voice through the smoke." He shook his head. "I've never been more determined about anything in my life." "I'm glad you were stubborn," she teased gently. "Determined," he corrected with a smile she could feel against her hair. "There's a difference, if you say so." She tilted her head up to look at him. "Either way, I'm grateful for your determination, for your courage, for everything that led us here." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and words gave way to touch, to the language of their bodies coming together in the darkness of their first night as husband and wife. Winter returned to Fort Garland, bringing with it the anniversary of their first meeting. On the night of December 15th, exactly 1 year after the fire, Thomas built a special fire in their hearth and presented Tessa with a gift, a small, leather-bound journal. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth cover. "Open it," he urged. Inside, on the first page, he had written in his neat, careful hand, "The story of us, beginning December 15, 1878. The following pages contained his recollections of that night, of seeing the smoke, of finding her in the burning Mercantile, of carrying her to safety. "Thomas," she breathed, deeply touched by the gesture, "this is beautiful." "I thought we could fill it together," he explained. "Write down our story as it unfolds, for our children someday, so they'll know how it all began." Tessa looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Our children." He smiled, a hint of shyness in his expression. "If you want them. I've been thinking lately that this house could use some more laughter in it." "I do want them," she said softly. "With you." They sat together before the fire, adding to the journal, reminiscing about their courtship and wedding, dreaming about the future they were building. Outside, snow began to fall, covering Fort Garland in a pristine blanket of white, but inside their home, warmth and love kept the cold at bay. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. As the land awakened from its winter sleep, Tessa discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled Thomas with a mixture of joy and nervous anticipation. "A baby," he kept saying, as if testing the reality of the word. "Our baby." Tessa laughed at his wonder. "Yes, our baby. Due sometime in November, Dr. Wilson thinks." Thomas immediately began expanding the house, adding a proper nursery adjacent to their bedroom. The townspeople rallied around them with offers of help and gifts for the coming child. Mrs. Henderson presented Tessa with a beautiful cradle that had been in her family for generations. "My children are grown and gone," the older woman said with a wistful smile. "And I never had grandchildren. It would please me to know this cradle will hold your little one." As summer turned to fall, Tessa's belly grew round with their child. Thomas became increasingly protective, insisting on doing the heavier chores and watching her like a hawk for any sign of distress. His concern touched her, though she sometimes had to remind him that pregnancy wasn't an illness. "I'm just being careful," he defended himself when she teased him about hovering. "You and the baby are the most precious things in my life." She softened at that, taking his hand and placing it on her belly where their child kicked vigorously. "We're fine, Thomas, strong and healthy, both of us." On a crisp November evening, with the first snow of the season falling gently outside, Tessa went into labor. Thomas sent for Dr. Wilson and Mrs. Henderson, then paced anxiously as the hours passed and his wife's pains intensified. "This is normal, Mrs. Henderson assured him as she bustled in and out of the bedroom with fresh linens and hot water. "Babies come in their own time." After 14 hours of labor, as the sun was rising on a new day, their son was born a robust boy with a shock of dark hair like his father's and eyes that Dr. Wilson predicted would turn blue. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he held his son for the first time. "Tessa, look what we made." Exhausted but radiant, Tessa reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "What shall we call him?" Thomas considered the small face that already showed signs of resembling his own. "What about Samuel? After my father." "Samuel Vaughn," Tessa tested the name. "I think it suits him perfectly." That night, with their son sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside their bed, Thomas added to their journal, recording the details of Samuel's birth and his own overwhelming feelings of love and gratitude. "I never thought I could be this happy," he told Tessa as he set the journal aside. "When I ran into that burning building last year, I was just trying to help someone in need. I had no idea I was running toward my future, toward you, toward this life we're building." Tessa reached for his hand. "Sometimes the best journeys begin with a single step taken in the right direction," she said. "Or in your case, a headlong rush into danger." He chuckled softly. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat, run into 100 burning buildings if it meant finding you at the end." "Let's hope that won't be necessary," she said with a smile. "One dramatic rescue is enough for a lifetime." As their son grew from infant to toddler, Thomas and Tessa's love deepened and matured. They faced the challenges of parenthood and rural life together, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the joyful ones. 3 years after Samuel's birth, they welcomed a daughter, whom they named Elizabeth after Tessa's mother. With her arrival, their family felt complete, their home filled with the laughter and energy of 2 healthy children. Thomas eventually realized his dream of owning a ranch, purchasing land adjacent to their property, and gradually building up a modest herd of cattle. Tessa, with his encouragement, opened a small bookshop in one room of the newly expanded Mercantile, ordering titles from Denver, and creating a lending library for the townspeople who couldn't afford to buy books outright. Fort Garland grew and prospered around them, the railroad bringing new settlers and opportunities to the mountain town. Thomas served on the town council, while Tessa taught reading classes for the children and adults who had never had the chance to learn. On the 10th anniversary of the fire that brought them together, Thomas surprised Tessa with a special celebration. He arranged for Mrs. Henderson to watch the children and took his wife for a ride into the mountains. There, in a secluded meadow with a view of the valley below, he had prepared a picnic. "You recognize this place?" he asked as he helped her from her horse. Tessa looked around, taking in the majestic pines and the distant peaks. "Should I?" He smiled, leading her to a flat rock where he'd laid out their meal. "This is where I stopped to rest on my way back to Fort Garland after visiting Catherine that first time. I sat right here and decided I needed to see you again, that whatever was growing between us was worth exploring." Tessa's eyes softened. "You never told me that." "I was saving it," he admitted, pulling out a bottle of wine he'd procured specially from Denver, "for a milestone worth marking." As they ate and drank and reminisced about the decade they'd shared, Tessa marveled at the twists and turns of fate that had led them to this point. "If that lamp hadn't fallen," she said thoughtfully, "if you hadn't been passing through town that night, if you hadn't noticed the smoke, I believe we would have found each other anyway," Thomas said with conviction. "Some things are meant to be, Tessa. Some loves are written in the stars." She smiled at his uncharacteristic romanticism. "When did my practical cowboy become such a poet?" "About the time a beautiful woman coughed her way into my arms through a wall of smoke," he replied with a grin. "You've changed me, Tessa Vaughn. For the better, I hope." "We've changed each other," she corrected gently. "That's what love does, it transforms us, little by little, day by day." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in silk. "Another anniversary gift?" Tessa asked, accepting it with a curious smile. "Open it and see." Inside was a locket, gold and intricately engraved. When she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal miniature portraits of Samuel and Elizabeth on one side, and on the other an inscription, "From flame to forever T&T." "Thomas," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "It's beautiful." He took the locket from her hands and fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. "Not as beautiful as you," he said softly. "Not as beautiful as the life you've given me." They made love there in the mountain meadow, with only the stars as witnesses, reaffirming the bond that had begun in fire and flourished through all the seasons of their life together. And as they rode home in the gathering twilight, Tessa knew with absolute certainty that the smoke and flames of that long-ago December night had led her not to an ending, but to the most glorious beginning she could have imagined. Years passed, and Fort Garland continued to grow and change with the times. Samuel followed in his father's footsteps, developing a keen interest in ranching and eventually taking over much of the day-to-day management as Thomas grew older. Elizabeth, with her mother's love of books and learning, became the town's schoolteacher after attending college in Denver, the first in their family to do so. Thomas and Tessa grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year, their bond strengthened by the challenges they'd faced and overcome as one. Their home remained the heart of their family, a gathering place for their children, and eventually their grandchildren, Samuel's twin boys and Elizabeth's daughter. On a quiet December evening, 40 years after the fire that had brought them together, Thomas and Tessa sat on the porch of their home, wrapped in blankets against the winter chill, watching the snow fall softly on the land they'd loved and tended for so long. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his voice still strong despite his 70 years, "about that night, about carrying you out of the smoke." Tessa reached for his hand, her fingers entwining with his as they had countless times over the decades. "What about it?" "I realized something," he said, turning to look at her, his blue eyes as intense as ever beneath his silver hair. "I didn't just save you that night, you saved me too." She tilted her head, a question in her eyes. "I was drifting before I met you," he explained. "Moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But you gave me a reason to stop drifting, to build something lasting, to become the man I was meant to be." Tessa leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. "We saved each other then," she murmured. "And look what we built from those ashes, a love, a family, a life." He pressed a kiss to her silvered hair. "The best life I could have imagined." As night fell fully around them, bringing with it the peace of a winter's evening in the mountains, they sat together in contented silence. Two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed, not just rescue from a moment's danger, but salvation from life's greatest peril, the prospect of living without love. And in the gentle snowfall, in the warmth of their enduring embrace, the story that began in flame and smoke continued to unfold, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of courage, and the brightest futures rise from the ashes of what might have been lost.